This evening, we've got a chap by the name of Ken Thompson, who is a retired member of staff from the University of Sheffield, who's had a very interesting career, sort of crossing over from plant ecology science to horticulture. Some of you may know him as a writer in the British Daily Telegraph on the garden pages on Saturday. He's also written a number of books. I can't remember how many now. Can we call them popular science? I think we could, couldn't we?
Some of them are just popular science, yeah. Some are gardening.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you've written, for example, a very interesting book on the whole issue about natives and invasives.
Yep.
Now, going back to really your days at Sheffield working with J. Philip Grime, you worked with on this a whole theory which gets called CSR theory, which stands for competitor stress tolerant ruderal. Ruderal meaning those plants that we tend to call pioneer plants or arable weeds. Now this was took a while to be accepted, but it has been hugely influential. And when I think the first publication was sort of around about 1979, wasn't it? When it sort of breached the surface. Round about then. Anyway,
a bit earlier than that, actually, but yes.
Earlier, yeah. I mean, I think I first came across it sort of late 1980s as a theory basically about plant survival strategies, and I, involved in gardening, was just blown away, because here was all of these explanations as to why so much of the traditional garden practice was kind of dysfunctional, like all of that bare ground, carefully hoed bare ground, providing this perfect seed bed for all those ruderal pioneer plants, for example. So for me, it gave me an enormous sort of theoretical insight, which I've used ever since in terms of the way I look at plants, putting plants together, and for not just about the kind of best chateau fitting plants to the environment, but much more thinking about long term, what plants do over time in order to stay there, not necessarily as a living plant, but perhaps as seeds for the next generation. Anyway, so Ken, perhaps could you just outline what CSR theory is all about in sort of no more than, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I've been worrying about this all day, Noel.
Oh dear, sorry.
It's wondering how to. I mean, I think CSR, frankly, in one sense, it's no more than putting on a kind of proper theoretical basis the simple observation that plants aren't all the same. And giving that a kind of formal framework to sort of slot plants into, giving them names, essentially. So as you said, its basis is that there are three extremes of specialization as far as plants are concerned. In fact, a lot of in-betweens as well, but at the extremes, there are just three. And competitors is one. And I think gardeners would recognize those as basically thugs. These are plants that like...
Yeah, the stinging nettle comes out at the top of that triangle.
Yeah, these are plants like nettles, like bracken, like rose bay willow herb, and so on, like reeds, like typha. Plants that basically take no prisoners. And often in the wild grow as monocultures. They've just eliminated all the competition, essentially. And they do that by liking to grow in habitats that are undisturbed and nutrient rich. That is
now even you are using this anthropogenic like, as if plants could establish a preference. It's very difficult to get away from, isn't it?
Yeah, it is very difficult. I mean, I'm just using that as a shorthand, obviously. I mean, that's what they like.
Sure, you wouldn't use it in an academic paper.
Yeah, in as much as if you put them in places that are not nutrient rich or are not undisturbed, they tend to die for one or another. And there are plenty of garden plants that are basically serious competitors, you know. And the thing about that is you have to be careful with those plants in gardens. You know, I suppose an extreme would be something like Gunnera. I mean, you have to kind of know what you're doing when you start planting things like that in gardens, because they will just basically take over, as will the weedy variety if you leave them. And then there's stress tolerators, and stress tolerators are plants that also don't like disturbance. They like undisturbed conditions, but they like unproductive conditions. That's where they do best. And what they're basically doing is they're making do with very little, essentially. So these are plants that tend to be not very big and certainly tend to be slow growing. And a lot of garden plants are either stress tolerators or are on the way to that corner of the triangle. And that's one of the main things, I think, that's one of the main points where CSR has an important lesson for gardeners, because gardeners, as you know, of course, Noel, one thing they all do is they use too much fertilizer. I mean, gardeners are very easily seduced by shiny boxes of NPK down at the garden centre, which have big, you know, big bright pictures on them and labels saying, you know, make your plants grow 10 times as fast with this mixture, or whatever. And the sad fact is that there are plenty of plants that will grow 10 times faster if you add those things to your garden. And they're called weeds. Whereas most of your actual garden plants won't take any notice at all if you add all that stuff to your garden, because they're either stress tolerators or they're on their, you know, they have a lot of stress tolerance in their makeup. So, you know, everything in the rock garden, for example, all the alpines, anything seriously shade tolerant, anything that likes it hot and dry, Mediterranean, they're all, you know, rosemary, thyme, convolvulus neorum, all those things. They're not going to take much notice if you give them more nutrients, because they're basically stress tolerators. They've evolved to make do with very little. And so they're not interested in extra NPK.
Now, I suppose in a way, all gardening is still there's this whole legacy of historically gardening has been about growing cabbages, and obviously the bigger your cabbage is, the better you can feed your family or your employer, whatever. And I think it's taken horticulture a very long time to kind of move away from that. And I think we probably have to thank the wildflower meadow creators who I think really kind of were the sort of vanguard of making people think much more critically about all of that NPK stuff. And we just had a note actually from Jenny Price Nelson in the States: best way to ruin a prairie plant is to fertilize. Yes,
the best way to ruin almost any natural plant community, diverse plant community, is to add fertilizer. I mean, this is one of the major features of plant ecology. That the most diverse, interesting plant communities are all on nutrient-poor soils, and essentially the plants that make them up are mostly stress tolerators. Quite small stress tolerators at that. Add fertilizer. What do you get? You get Arenatherum, you get nettles, you get bracken, you get rubbish. So those are the, and then the other corner of the triangle, as you've already mentioned, is the rudderals. And these are plants which they like nutrient-rich, resource-rich conditions, but what they also like is severe disturbance. They're always preparing for the next disaster, basically. So arable weeds are kind of the classic example, and also garden weeds. All good garden weeds are either ruderals or competitors, or the best of all, actually, the very best garden weeds, by which I mean the very worst, are kind of halfway between ruderals and competitors. They don't mind. They don't mind a bit of occasional severe disturbance, as long as there's plenty of nutrients and light that allow them to recover faster than anything else around them.
Yes,
so something like bindweed would be an absolute classic. You know, the more horrible you are to bindweed, the happier it is, basically, because it just can come back so quickly.
Yeah,
being, you know, so if you're the kind of gardener who looks out the window one day and thinks, "Oh my God, where did all that bindweed come from?" and rushes out there with a flamethrower or a machete, you know, and bindweed just loves that. That's what bindweed's been waiting for you to do, because then it comes back faster than everything else. And the problem, 2 weeks' time, the problem's twice as bad. So CSR just helps you to kind of pigeonhole these plants and to understand what is actually going on.
I mean, I had quite some engagement with it when I did my doctoral thesis at Sheffield in the kind of early 2000s. And, you know, there is that algorithm, isn't there? And you feed in various measurements, and there's that whole program for measuring leaf surface area, which we did on the photocopier and all of that. And you come out with these determinations. It's quite good fun, but it didn't kind of lead me anywhere. And it's interesting that obviously around about the same time, various people in Germany, most notably Cassian Schmidt at Sicherungsgarten Hermannshof, was also obviously looking at this, and CSR theory has had a whole kind of second life in Germany. But I asked him once, well, have you done any determinations of CSR for particular plants? No, he hadn't. It's sort of they've taken it on as another level, but actually in a way that's actually very useful in terms of, you know, classifying different types of planting and really relating that to the levels and type of maintenance. So I've certainly found it a very, very useful kind of conceptual framework. Moving on, you then became instrumental in the 2 bugs projects, which were really important in Britain in terms of addressing what domestic gardens can offer wildlife. You know, that particular flag has now very much been taken up by the RHS. But so how did the bugs projects come about?
Well, I've always been a huge fan of Jennifer Owen and her writing her 2 books on her Leicester garden.
So you better explain for the non-English, non-Brits here who Jennifer Owen was. It's a patron saint here, but
Jennifer Owen is the patron saint of wildlife gardening. She spent 30 years catching and identifying and counting just about everything in her garden in Leicester. Her very ordinary garden in Leicester. Nothing, a very ordinary garden in a very ordinary part of Britain. And what she did was she single-handedly overturned the idea that was very prevalent when she started, that basically gardens are some kind of wildlife desert. It's hard looking back now to realize how everyone thought that gardens were just too tidy, too unnatural, too alien, and that basically there couldn't be any wildlife in gardens, and we didn't even need to look because it was so obvious that there was no wildlife in gardens. Why waste our time looking? And Jennifer Owen did spend 30 years looking, and showed that in fact that idea was completely false. You know, her garden was just stuffed with all kinds of fascinating stuff, and she found a whole bunch of species that had never been recorded in Britain before, and she found half a dozen species that had never been recorded. I mean, we're new to science. So starting from that, me and a few other people in Sheffield took advantage of a bit of NERC money, Research Council money that was lying around looking like no one particularly wanted it, to to do this big study of wildlife in gardens in Sheffield, because good as Jennifer Owen's work is, it's only one garden.
Yes.
So we wanted to do a much more comparative study. So we looked at a large number of, well, relatively large number of gardens, 60 gardens in Sheffield, and did the best we could with a sort of wildlife survey, and measured everything else we could possibly think of in these gardens, basically to find out what it was, as far as we could, that was really controlling whether a garden was good for wildlife or not. And it was great fun. It's probably the most interesting thing I've ever done, actually, in my
wow.
Yeah.
And so what were the magic factors?
Well, the magic factor, there really is only one magic factor, and that essentially is the quantity of stuff.
Simple biomass.
The quantity of green stuff. Yeah. I mean, the more you have, the more shrubs, the more hedges, the more trees, the more wildlife you have. And that's just kind of inevitable, because all that stuff is it's habitat on the one hand, and on the other hand it's food.
Yes.
Because of course at the base of the whole garden food web is plants. So the more plants you have, and the more variety of plants, and the more quantity of plants, the more insects and other herbivores you have living in and on and eating those plants.
Yes.
And the more of everything else you have eating all those herbivores, and right on up to the top of the food chain, basically. So that was that. I mean, I'm simplifying enormously now, and I wrote a little book about this. If anybody wants to read all the gory details, but yeah, that's it really. You know, there was other stuff as well, but that head and shoulders above anything else, that was the message.
Yeah. I seem to recall there was a particularly strong correlation with trees, and there wasn't exactly quite clear why, but the presence of trees in a garden is a really major factor for biodiversity.
Yeah, it is. Trees are just, I mean, basically because they're so big. I mean, they provide habitat and food in quantities that nothing else can match. And they also I think modify the environment in a way, and they provide a lot of food also, even when they're dead.
Yes.
So trees are very instrumental in providing that large quantities of organic matter being added to the soil. And of course, huge amount of biodiversity in gardens lives in and on the soil. So that's very important. You know, lots of plants, lots of roots, lots of dead plant material falling onto the soil. Again, that's habitat, that's food, and it's full of animals eating the litter, eating each other, and being eaten by everything else in the garden, by birds, by reptiles, by amphibians.
Yeah, and I mean, I think as someone who's sort of very much been involved in promoting so-called naturalistic planting over the last 20 years or so, an awful lot of that has unfortunately been expressed in terms of this sort of stylized meadows, you know, the sort of peat out of look, or the plantings at Hermanshof, or those sort of wanting to get that kind of romance of the wildflower meadow, but over a longer season and with more plants in it. And that inevitably that style of planting has a limitation, because it lacks that woody plant element. And so, you know, I'm sort of thinking now, actually, the thing that British horticulture was really good at from up to the 20th century was the mixed border, which was always a sort of always a bit of an unsung unsung garden project in a way, but the mixed border that does allow you just to integrate all those plant forms, a lot of which is about getting good seasonal interest, and by the by, I can imagine being the basis for actually really, really good biodiversity.
Yeah, the mixed border, in a sense, was kind of ahead of its time in wildlife terms. I mean, I remember seeing Fergus Garrett, talking about his biodiversity audit at Great Dixter.
Yes.
And I mean, the biodiversity at Great Dixter is just astronomical. I mean,
yes.
But I mean, even he said that big board, the classic photo of Great Dixter that everyone takes, with the house in the background and the big long mixed border.
Yes.
He said that mixed border, even within Great Dixter, that is the biodiversity hotspot.
Right. Yeah.
Garden. That is just fantastic, and that's just packed with plants, big plants, shrubs, the occasional small tree, just everything all rammed together.
Yes.
Lots of variety, lots of biomass, a lot going on.
And actually, regarding Dixter, one of the things that I think some of us have felt slightly odd about Dixter over the years is that it's a very highly maintained garden. There's a lot of soil disturbance going on. There's a lot of kind of sticking in of, for want of a better word, bedding plants for a few months and whipping them out, putting something else in. I mean, it's very high energy, quite high maintenance. But in fact, of course, one of the great lessons of sort of my readings of all the CSR work all those years ago was that actually disturbance is good. The most biodiverse habitats experience some level of disturbance, and that's what Dixter is offering in probably just that right amount.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you let the competitors have their head,
yes,
you will end up with a low diversity, and they will just eliminate everything else. But the kind of upside of that is that if you have a highly fertile system full of potential competitors, it can take a lot of punishment. In other words, if you go in there, guns blazing, and lay about you with your machete and make space,
yes,
and let things self-seed and make a few holes and bung things in, you can maintain diversity.
Yes.
You can maintain diversity. It's just that it's a bit like pushing water uphill. As you say, it's a high energy, high maintenance environment.
Yes.
If you do it, the result can be terrific.
Yeah. Now, one comment has come up. Doug Tallamy would love this conversation. Now, Doug Tallamy, of course, is the American writer, not the first by any means. I mean, there was actually a lady called Sarah Stein, who died a few years ago, who was the first American popular garden writer who really promoted the use of native plants in American gardens for biodiversity. Then along came Doug Tallamy, who was very much the right man at the right place, the right time. And I mean, Doug Tallamy has promoted native plants for American wildlife in a way that's perhaps best described as evangelical. At times, I think possibly sort of slightly bulldozing the science. Evangelism is somewhat too strident. The situation here, I think, probably is very different in that, our North European invertebrate flora tends to be quite generalist, doesn't it? Whereas I think in the States, you possibly have a lot more specialists. So, the issues perhaps are different.
Yes, I think when it comes to talking about the relative merits of natives and aliens, we do have to be very careful about where we're talking about.
Yes.
Because America is not like here, and certainly, New Zealand, for example, is not like here.
Yes.
Britain is probably the place on the planet where it's most difficult to make an argument really in favor of needing native plants for wildlife. And that's partly because of our checkered, glaciated history, of course.
Yes, yes.
You know, even what is a native in Britain is a kind of odd question to ask, in a sense, because Britain's been wiped clean by glaciers so often in the last 3 million years. And what you find if you look back at the record is that every time Britain was recolonized from Europe at the end of a glaciation, we got a rather different set of European plants here.
Yes.
So no two interglacials were ever the same.
No.
So what was native then isn't native now, and vice versa. I mean,
yes.
The famous example, of course, that I always quote is that Rhododendron ponticum, which now everyone hates, was, of course, a British native in the last interglacial.
Yes. It has, because it has the most extraordinarily disjunct population, doesn't it? I mean, actually, from within an hour of where I am in central Portugal, I could take you to some genuine wild Rhododendron ponticum.
Absolutely.
There's a few more in Spain, and then the next lot are where the far end of Turkey, aren't they? I mean, extraordinary disjunct distribution. So obviously, it once covered everywhere from Portugal to Turkey. Therefore, it must have been in Britain as well, which explains, perhaps why it does so wonderfully, and what is a native.
Indeed, and it's not at all happy in Portugal now, of course, because of climate change. Its long-term future is probably a bit insecure. And
replacement of oak by the wretched eucalyptus.
Yes. But don't worry, it's doing well in Britain.
Yeah. I mean, what is your take? I mean, on the invasives issue. I mean, again, in Britain, we're probably lucky. I mean, I dare say the person pulling out Japanese knotweed might not feel so, but in Britain, I think we have been extraordinarily lucky in not having some of the invasives problems that many other countries have had.
Yeah, there are a number of reasons for that. One is that, as I just said, our history means that basically the British flora is a collection of slightly ragamuffin invasives.
Yeah.
Anyway, I mean,
you could say the same of the population, really, couldn't you?
you could say the same about the human population.
Yes,
exactly.
Yes.
We acquired at the end of the last glaciation, the most nimble, aggressive, fast-moving, opportunist European flora, and so in a sense we have a bunch of invasives already. So it's a bit tough for other invasives to kind of muscle in at this stage. But the other thing I think, to a large extent, is our climate. I mean, we have an interesting climate in Britain, because you can grow almost anything in Britain. We have this very mild sort of equable climate, oceanic climate. You can grow almost anything, but we have these rather cool, rather nondescript summers, which is why everyone goes to Portugal for their holidays, of course, in Britain. And one result of that is that a lot of plants we grow come from climates with hotter summers. And plants that come from habitats with hotter summers tend to need those hotter summers to reproduce. They need the time and the heat to flower and set seed and so on, and really become successful and established. So in Britain, we're in the curious situation of having a climate that allows us to grow almost anything, but it's very hard for many of those plants to really become at home, because although they can grow here, they can't reproduce. So, I mean, my favorite example is always wisteria. Both Japanese and Chinese wisterias are major invasives in North America.
Yeah.
In Britain, you tell people in Britain that, and they go, "Really? How how is that possible? Because
yes.
when did you last see a self-sown wisteria in Britain?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just not hot enough in the summer for these plants to set seed.
Yes.
So they just behave themselves.
I mean, climate change might knock that one on the head. I mean, we've got a bit of stuff coming up in the chat about miscanthus, about that being a real problem in the United States. And Nina is surprised that Britain doesn't have a problem with miscanthus. I'm afraid I would add yet to that. And in fact, or more so, Cortaderia, the pampas grass. One of the most kind of despised and mocked plants in the entire kind of florilegium of the British gardeners. If you drive to northern Spain, Cantabria, Galicia, the Basque country, the wretched stuff is everywhere. It grows in the cracks in pavements, all the motorway embankments. Cortaderia it's horrendous, and the climate, so it's just slightly warmer summers in that actually rather wet strip of northern Spain. A bit of climate change, and I'm afraid the pampas grass could become, it's one of those things I would begin to worry about in England.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting you mentioned Cortaderia, because I don't think climate was ever really the problem with Cortaderia in Britain. Botanists in Britain actually have puzzled over. Cortaderia is starting to become quite well established in Britain now, but it's taken a long time because we've been growing Cortaderia for forever. And the reason, the underlying reason why it's been so slow to take off in Britain seems to be slightly curious one, which is that unlike most grasses, Cortaderia is dioecious. It's got male and female plants, and the most desirable cultivars in Britain, at least, have always been female.
Right. Yeah.
So for a very long time, the overwhelming majority of plants in Britain planted in gardens were female. And I think there just weren't enough male pampas grass around to allow them to produce any seed.
Yes.
But then I think what happened is they did manage, those female plants, to produce some seed. And when those seedlings grew up, some of them obviously were male.
Yes.
And so you had more male plants, which meant there was more pollen around, which meant more of all those female plants in gardens suddenly were able to start producing seed for the first time, which meant then you had more seedlings and more males.
Yes.
So you got into this kind of autocatalytic
cycle of
process cycle.
Yes.
And now, I think somebody said Devon and Cornwall. I mean, I'm in Devon here. I mean, I've just got to look at the railway tracks across the park here from where I'm sitting.
Yeah.
I mean, that gravel is great,
Yes.
In among the buddleia, which has been there for a long time.
Yeah.
There's now almost as much Cortaderia.
Oh, really? Oh, my God. It's on the march then. It's on the way.
I think Cortaderia is now well away in Britain.
Yes.
Especially in the south.
Yeah. Right. Well, yes, of course, one nasty thing about it is it creates a second season for hay fever sufferers, doesn't it?
Yes. I don't get hay fever, so I just I laugh in the face of hay fever.
Poor old Nigel suffers, doesn't he? As a meadow man involved in making meadows. That's a
Does he really? Oh,
terrible affliction.
Isn't that terrible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, well, he soldiers on every year. So moving on. In your writings in the Telegraph, you've sort of tilted at various. Hang on. We've got a question actually come up from Nina. I'm trying to overlay Csr theory with successional stages, ruderals in pioneer settings, competitors in climax communities, and everything else in Cyril, somewhere in between. Am I trying to put a square peg in a round hole?
Yeah, I think probably you are actually. Certainly the plants that kick off secondary successions usually are ruderals of one kind or another.
Yes.
But where you go from there depends entirely on what kind of habitat you have. You may go to competitors if you have the right kind of environment with lots of nutrients, lots of water.
And a local supply of seed, of course. That's always,
but if you don't, you can quite easily end up in a stress tolerant dominated environment.
Yeah, so moving on. I mean, I know that you are very much a scientist and believe that any materials and methods we use in gardening should be evidence-based. And gardening, of course, as one of the things I find rather intriguing about it is, I mean, all spheres of life have their kind of hucksters and mountebanks, but in gardening, there've been particularly strong tradition of, for want of a better word, folklore, people, many of them actually perfectly genuine, promoting products or methods that they believe are the kind of answer to everything. And we can kind of laugh at some of the, or be horrified by some of the material that was being promoted by Victorian gardeners. But, you know, over the last sort of couple of decades, we've seen sort of this very evangelical promotion of things like rock flour and Bio-char, mycorrhiza. Now, that is one thing that we now know that so many plants, woody plants in particular, do have intimate arrangements with mycorrhizal fungi. So why not picking up one of the packets of mycorrhizal fungi at the garden centre? Is that not going to help?
Most of the time, no. For a variety of reasons. I mean, certainly correct that the great majority of plants are indeed mycorrhizal. Of that, there is no doubt. Most of the world's flora evolved with mycorrhizas. But a number of things. I'm wondering where to start here. A number of things. The first is that mycorrhizas are actually everywhere. So if you went and dug up any bucket full of soil from your local park or anywhere, you would find it was absolutely full of mycorrhizas. And even more than the mycorrhizas that were actually actively growing, there would be spores in there of other mycorrhizas just waiting for a chance to get going. So adding mycorrhizas is very often redundant. Because what people find is there's one or two classic studies actually. Let me tell you this. There's one or two classic studies where people have grown mycorrhizal plants that would like to be mycorrhizal in containers of sterile material and added mycorrhizas to pots, some pots and not others, you know, the classic experiment, and found that the mycorrhizas help. The mycorrhizas help the plants to grow. They grow better, they're healthier than the non-mycorrhizal plants. But if you then put all those plants, mycorrhizal and non-mycorrhizal, in the ground, and come back a year or two later, you find that all those differences that you could see when you had them in the pots of sterile soil have gone. And when you dig them up, what you find is they're all mycorrhizal. They're all infected because the mycorrhiza is just there in the soil.
Yeah.
So nothing has been gained by adding mycorrhizas. If a plant's mycorrhizal, if a plant would like to be mycorrhizal, it will normally manage to lay its hands on the mycorrhizas it needs from the soil anyway.
Yeah.
Without you adding them.
So you don't have these incredibly specific kind of.
They're not enormously specific. No. And even if they were, it wouldn't help, because who's to say the mycorrhiza you buy from the garden centre is the one you want?
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, so That's one problem. Another problem is, I have to say, gardening. Because there's really nothing about gardening that mycorrhizas like.
No.
They don't like a lot of digging, because digging just chops them up. You know, I mean, a mycorrhizal is a massive interconnected network of mycelia in the soil. You start digging it up, it's not happy. And what they really don't like, and I'm coming back to something we started out with a while ago, is fertilizer.
Yes.
That's what they really don't like, because basically the plant mycorrhizal association is not obligatory. It's not compulsory. None of these plants that normally grow with mycorrhizas in the wild, they don't have to have them. It's a deal. It's a quid pro quo, a trade between the plant and the fungus in the soil. And the plant supplies the fungus. Essentially, the plant supplies the fungus with carbon, and the fungus supplies the plant with phosphorus. It's a deal. Both benefit, both get something they didn't have enough of on their own. But if you go out there in the garden, like many gardeners do, and start shoveling NPK onto the garden with gay abandon, what you find is your mycorrhizal plants turn around and say, well, thank you very much. That's very nice. I don't think I need to pay these mycorrhizas anymore, so I'm not going to. And basically, plants are capable of doing that.
Yes.
They just stop supplying the carbon.
And you say NPK, and presumably that would apply to organically supplied as well as inorganic.
Yeah, makes no difference where the NPK is coming from.
No
difference at all. It's all the same to the plant.
So, I mean, the very, very firm lesson here is keep all that fertilizer, organic or inorganic, to the vegetable patch and the vegetable patch alone.
Yes, your vegetable patch isn't very mycorrhizal friendly anyway, because of all that digging and all the rest. So yeah, put the fertilizer on where you're essentially being a farmer.
Yes.
Yeah, that's where you keep your fertilizer. You forget about mycorrhizas. The rest of the garden, disturb it as little as you can.
Yes.
Don't add any fertilizer, and probably your plants will be nicely mycorrhizally infected, as they should be.
Yes. Yep. Oh, interesting. Yeah, good take on that. Now, you've also a question come up. What do you suggest for areas where the topsoil has been removed? Is addition of compost an answer?
Well, yes. This is something else. Another point worth making is that of course there are places, there are gardens where it really is worth applying mycorrhizas, because these days, if many new houses, what you have outside the front door, I mean, your house builder would no doubt describe it as soil, but it's not. It's just a collection of rubble and bricks and subsoil, and in a situation like that, or in fact anywhere where previous management has been very mycorrhizal unfriendly, there probably is a shortage of mycorrhizas. So, for example, people have shown that mycorrhizas are helpful if you're trying to establish trees on former intensive arable land, because there's nothing worse for mycorrhizas than intensive arable farming. I mean, everything about it: disturbance, fertilizers, fungicides, it's fatal. So you're trying to get trees, and trees are all mycorrhizal, to grow on former arable land. You very often have to add mycorrhizas because they just aren't there. But I'm just saying, the normal healthy soil, one that hasn't been over fertilized, over disturbed, damaged in some way, usually has plenty of mycorrhizas anyway.
But organic matter in the form of compost is a way of sort of perhaps boosting their populations in these situation.
Yeah, organic matter is always a good idea for a long list of reasons.
Yes.
One of them is, of course, that as it breaks down, it supplies nutrients, and the mycorrhizas forage for those nutrients, supply them to especially phosphorus. Phosphorus is the key.
Yeah. Yep. And you've also written about forest gardening, and we talked about permaculture, but neither of us could actually have ever had a satisfactory definition of permaculture. So maybe that's tilting at windmills. But I mean, forest gardening is something that is a sort of, it's one of those things that people like the sound of. I see very, very, very few people actually doing it effectively. What's your take on it?
Forest gardening. Well, I don't know what to say about forest gardening, because I find there's nothing wrong with forest gardening. I mean, trying to grow anything under trees, of course, severely limits what you can actually grow. And my problem with forest gardening, if I have one, is that I have in the past read extravagant claims about what forest gardening can do in terms of producing food. That's the basic problem.
And I think that may go back to its origins, well, possibly in Australia, in a tropical climate, because in the tropics, with much higher light levels reaching the forest floor, you can indeed grow quite a lot under trees, and these kind of agroecological systems are, in the tropics, can be enormously productive. But of course, Britain is not in the tropics.
Yeah, probably in climates where it basically is out in the open, too hot, too dry for a lot of plants. And basically a kind of partial woody canopy is kind of just taking the edge off that climate and actually ameliorating the climate and allowing things to do better. But in Britain, of course, in dull, dismal, drizzly Britain, the thing that you have to grow food is light.
Yes.
And of course, a woodland has plenty of light. It has the same amount of light as anywhere else, but that light's at the top of the canopy.
Yes.
So the woodland, woodlands are very productive. They're very productive systems. There's no doubt about that. But the productivity is wood and leaves.
Yes. Or possibly, if you've chosen the right trees, nuts.
And if you've chosen the right trees, a few nuts.
Yeah.
Exactly. Also, if you're prepared to ride shotgun during the nut season to stop the squirrels.
Yes. Yes. Another problem. Yeah.
Another problem.
Yes.
But even if you can grow a few nuts, I mean, frankly, there's just not enough nuts produced by a walnut tree or a sweet chestnut tree to keep body and soul together. Not compared with the same area of land growing potatoes, peas, carrots, all the things we normally grow.
Yes.
So it's not that the productivity of woodland is a problem. It's not. It's the nature of that productivity.
That's right. Yeah.
Just growing. It's producing lots of stuff that won't keep you alive.
Yes.
And isn't very pleasant to eat, or in fact is completely inedible.
Yes. I mean, personally, I've always been rather suspicious of these kind of systems that are promoted with sort of evangelical fervor. That always makes me skeptical. We've had another question that's come up actually regarding, going back to the previous issue, how do we, they're talking about soils, damaged soils on former building sites. How do we reconcile this with the plants growing so successfully in building rubble? And I think the question is probably referring to some of the sort of stuff that Nigel has been doing, which is sort of basically stress tolerant plants on former industrial sites.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's no mystery about that. You just need the right plants.
Yes, yes.
You need plants that don't mind dry, infertile conditions.
Yes.
And there are plenty of such plants.
Yes, yes. And actually, we in Europe are extremely lucky in having, I think, a huge, our limestone flora is wonderfully diverse. And those are the sort of things that do grow extremely well on these kind of sites.
Yeah. And that kind of, what people like about that also, of course, is it does very much discourage weeds.
Yes, yes, yes.
Because of your typical temperate British weeds are not that fond of growing on rubble because it's too dry.
Yes. Yeah. Great, good. So if there's any more questions, I think we've dealt with most of the questions and points as we've gone through. No more questions? No, great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Ken. That was really interesting. Good to have that sort of real run through of a very interesting career, and I think many of you will find do check out CSR Theory and J. Philip Grimes' work. I've always found it extraordinarily informative, particularly for anyone who's interested in ecological planting design. So thank you very much, and hopefully see all you guys next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Noel. Bye.
And we'll see Annie next week as well.
Good. Missed Annie.
Missed Annie. I'll tell her you missed Annie.
Haven't seen her for 10 years.
No, hasn't changed a bit. A bit. Okay, good night.
No.